Alrighty, good morning everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our classes in quarantine. We're going to be continuing our discussion of the media today, but first do hold on a second while I get my live chat going. Alright, there we go. So, good morning everybody. If you're out there, go ahead and say hello in the chat. Let me know that you're out there. It really does help having a live audience. And we are going to continue our discussion of the U.S. media. Let's see where we left off. I did get my cool new presentation format fixed for you. So that's cool. We talked about media bias already. I always forget how long Chapter 9 is. Hope everybody out there is... Morning, Kennedy. Hope everybody out there is doing okay. Hope everybody out there is staying safe and washing their hands and otherwise... helping or otherwise surviving this this crisis that we're in the middle of. Right. So we left off talking about the Telecom Act of 1996, and I couldn't get my video to play properly. So before we move on, why don't we actually take a second just to watch the effects of the end of, or the Telecom Act of 1996 and the end of its restrictions on Sorry, there's a very specific video that I'm looking for. Where is it? I'm not finding it, which is always fun. There we go.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio.
So I'm going to start this video over, and hopefully this time you'll actually be able to hear it. So I'm going to mute my mic, and hopefully we can actually hear what this sounds like, because it is actually really chilling.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these things simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 You get the point. And my point is that this is the result of the 1996 telecom reform and its loosening of restrictions on cross-ownership and ownership in multiple media markets, such that that conglomerate, which is called Sinclair Media, which required every single one of their news anchors to read that script calling out fake news. As I said in my last lecture, some people resigned over that script. That script was handed out to many, many, many local TV stations, including our own Channel 3, and was read on the air because it was required to be read on the air. This is a media conglomerate that reaches something like 70% of American households, and most people don't even know they're watching it. So then that is the sort of consolidation that was enabled by the 1996 Telecoms Act. Oh, hey, we got 6 people watching now. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for rising early with me. And we're going to continue our conversation about media and how media around the world is distinct. So American media is different from the US because we do have uniquely free press in the United States. The First Amendment essentially requires government to leave print media alone. And so that freedom of the press, that strong tradition against media regulation, is a major part of the American DNA at this point. On the other hand, most international countries, most other countries around the world, didn't actually develop commercial broadcast media first. So you got to remember that the television was invented here in the United States. That invention and its commercialization were channeled by our media regulation, our First Amendment, our understanding of media as essentially having nearly absolute freedom. But in most other cases, this new technology, this television, it came as a kind of a shock. It didn't gradually develop. It was just like, oh, hey, there's this thing that the Americans made, and it's pretty cool. And so in a lot of other countries, they began their television infrastructure by subsidizing it, by building government-owned TV stations. And government-owned stations are the norm in pretty much every country around the world. That's not to say that we're talking about Iranian state-owned TV or China's CCTV or anything like that. Democratic countries have publicly owned, tax-funded television stations. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, is a publicly owned television station, is an agency of the British government. There are certain laws in place in order to protect its independence and things like that. So you still see, hard-hitting, critical journalism on the BBC. It's perhaps not as raucous and partisan as some of our American media, but you still see, credible journalism happening on these democratically owned stations. Or on these government-owned stations in democratic countries. And it's hard to imagine the audience for public media in other countries. So in Norway, the audience for, at any given time, because in none of these countries can you only get government-owned media anymore. The media is globalizing, as we'll talk about. And so you can get, the same 500 channels that anyone else can get. Yay! Good morning! But despite all that, still in Norway, 70% of television viewers watching TV at any one time are probably watching one of the government's public TV stations. The BBC in Britain is still almost half of the media audience there. And when you look at public media in the United States, we have a very, very different experience of that. I mean, public media in the United States, we're talking, PBS and NPR, which serve a vital role, don't get me wrong, and I watch a lot of PBS, love my Rick Steves Europe, but PBS obviously gathers only a fraction of the audience that the BBC does when they're like half of Britain's TV viewership at any one time. So let's see. It should also be noted that media around the world is commercializing, and former government-owned stations are being spun off into privatized wings, and so you can see that there's often a major connection between media personalities and politics. The Berlusconi family kind of controls Italy's television market, and Silvio Berlusconi was Prime Minister of Italy 4 times in a row. So obviously some unscrupulous actors can drive media narratives in the way that they want, and that can be a powerful political tool. Really quickly before we move on, I should mention that oftentimes the productions put on by public media in other countries dwarf what would have been put together by public media here in the United States. I mean, I don't know if I have any Doctor Who fans out there, but this is a high-budget show, right? Doctor Who is a sci-fi time-traveling adventure series. It's got explosions and special effects and all manner of, creepy space monsters and things like that. It's not a cheap show to run. They do on-location shoots all over the world. It's not a cheap show to run. It's a good show. I think you should watch it, but it's not inexpensive. I can't imagine PBS in the United States producing something like Doctor Who. Producing something where, they're spending a decent chunk of money doing special effects, doing sets, doing costumes, doing location shooting. We leave that for the free market here in the United States. Our public media typically concentrates solely on things that it feels that are not going to get covered in the private media. And that's why, for example, PBS is a major provider of children's educational television, because children quite famously have rather limited buying power, and so marketing children's television is not usually terribly profitable. So where do you get Big Bird? PBS, right? And things like PBS NewsHour, where they try to do news programming, because news programming is often underfunded in the corporate media. So that's the situation in democratic countries across the world. In authoritarian nations, censorship is the norm. Right? In authoritarian nations, the government controls the media, and government censors the media messages that go out. Governments are going to say, hey, if you print something that is unflattering to us, we will shut you down, we will, put you in prison, we might torture your family, stuff like that. Accordingly, authoritarian governments spend a lot of time making sure that they control the media narrative, which I'm not going to say that Donald Trump is a ridiculous tyrant, but he sure does spend a lot of time controlling the media narrative, doesn't he? Or at least wishing he could. But democracy can only flourish with the free flow of ideas and information. You have to be able to know what's going on around you in order to participate in democracy, right? I talked about earlier in this lecture about how in the 1830s, the penny press first enabled the conception of mass popular democracy as a thing, right? And so media is essential to informing citizens and allowing them to collectively take political action. And dictators know that, right? Dictators know that democracy only flourishes in an environment of the free flow of information, so they screw that up, right? So they use censorship, so they block the free flow of information. And often, by the way, not another tactic often used by modern dictators is something that they call flooding the zone, where maybe they don't necessarily censor everything, but they fill the media space up with so much doubt and so many alternative ideas that just trying to figure out what's true is a taxing exercise. And if that sounds familiar, it's because this is a tactic that Trump uses all the time. Another person who does this often is, Trump's good friend Vladimir Putin. But so even in authoritarian dictatorships, though, even in the nations that have most tried to engage in censorship, it is becoming more and more difficult to do so. I think I talked about this a bit in Chapter 6, but I mentioned the 2011 Chinese high-speed train crash. Had a major high-speed train crash in China. The high-speed rail there is a major part of their infrastructure, their development program. It's kind of the crown jewel of China's development policy. And so when there was a crash, it was very, very damaging to the Chinese Communist Party. So they were trying to suppress the news of it. Don't let anyone find out about it. If nobody hears about it, then who's to say it ever happened? And then a little girl, an 11-year-old girl, got on the Chinese version of Twitter and tweeted, "Why are the high-speed trains running so slow today?" And people started picking up the story and looking into it and passing along the message. And so China famously has the Great Firewall of China, right? They have their own parallel media institutions, their own version of Facebook, their own version of YouTube, their own version of Twitter, but they're all censored by the Chinese government, right? And so, authoritarians are gonna authoritarian, and they tried to stop this message from spreading on Chinese Twitter, but it took off. It took off so quickly that at some points there were tens of thousands of posts a minute about this high-speed rail crash. And eventually, the people on the internet in China managed to force the Chinese Communist Party to admit that this thing happened and to announce taking steps for reforms in terms of high-speed rail operating practices. And I know that it may not be super fun to talk about, high-speed rail operating practices, but this indicates that new media challenges the ability of authoritarian regimes to control information. And when authoritarian regimes lose that ability, they start losing the ability to be authoritarian. Okay, so talking about American media in the world, because our media is distinctive, it has enormous reach, and it is, in many cases, supplanting local media outlets that try to take root. So, for those of you who maybe haven't traveled all that widely, which, at 20 years old, I hadn't traveled all that widely either, so don't feel too bad, but those of you who haven't traveled all that widely, it's hard to overstate the degree to which the world consumes American media. It is very simple to turn on a television in many a foreign country and find, American TV shows, American movies. And I just remember feeling so strange when in 2012 I went to go visit my then wife, who was spending a year teaching English in Taiwan, and went out shopping, went out to go do some sightseeing, went out to actually go find some food because I loves me some street food. And at the time I didn't speak much in the way of Chinese, couldn't read any of the signs. I'm walking down this street, which is like the most foreign place that I've ever been. And there's little motor scooters loaded up with all manner of things kind of zipping around me everywhere, and everybody's speaking in a language that I don't really understand, and it was the most foreign place that I had ever been at that point. And then I'm walking by a shop, and they're playing Lady Gaga's Poker Face. And it was just like, huh. In this place that is the most foreign place that I've ever been, here is American media. And that is, by the way, the case the world over. So I saw Terminator Genisys in Warsaw, Poland. My wife saw Twilight New Moon in Taiwan. I think it was New Moon. It might have been Eclipse. I remember spending one particularly hot day in Croatia, watching Independence Day on our tiny little Airbnb TV. I mean, I was seriously about yay big. With Croatian subtitles on it, and Will Smith, Welcome to Earth, like Independence Day. It was fun, and the point of this monologue is not just to brag about how much traveling I've done, although I am really proud of it, but also to talk about how dominant American media is. CNN is a staple in every corner of the world. The only place I've ever been where I could not get CNN in my hotel room is China. And that's because you can only get CCTV in China. Hello, Naomi. Everybody say hi to Naomi. So CNN is a staple in every corner of the world, and U.S. media, U.S. movies, U.S. television, U.S. music is absolutely dominant in many, many parts of, and all over the world, The whole world listens to the same pop music that you do. The whole world watches many of the same television shows and movies that you do, especially like big budget action blockbusters. Dramas and comedies can often be harder to translate. Talk about that in a second. So the U.S. media model is shifting the way other countries do media. I mentioned most democracies have, or most other countries have publicly owned television stations, and we don't do that. We have a highly for-profit, highly commercialized media, a media that is designed to go out and find new audiences and be constantly growing, constantly growing. And we export it all over the world to the point that some nations get worried that their own local media infrastructures are going to kind of atrophy just because so many of their people consume so much American media. And I mean, it's not an unfounded fear. When was the last time you went and watched a movie in the movie theaters from another country? It does happen sometimes. I mean, Parasite won Best Picture this year, right? But that's South Korean, for those who don't know. But it doesn't happen all that often, right? It's not all that frequent that foreign media comes over to the United States. Whereas, on the other hand, American media is exported to every country of the world, to the point that some countries actually put in regulations to try and keep it out. Our dear neighbor to the north, America's hat, Canada, has laws on the books where if you have a TV station in Canada cable or broadcast, either way, you need to provide 30% of your content must be content that was produced in Canada. Now, does that mean that Canadian TV looks all that different from American TV? No, it doesn't, because it turns out that actually a lot of the television shows that you watch every day, turns out a lot of them are filmed in Canada. This Canadian content restriction basically created a Canadian film industry. Vancouver is now known as Hollywood North. So a lot of the TV shows that you see are filmed in Canada because, if you're going to film in Chicago or Toronto, they're like a couple hours drive away. And, if you film in Toronto, then you can release for the Canadian market too and count as Canadian content, which is a useful thing in this environment. But Canada is so concerned about losing the capacity to do television and to do music and things like that, they actually have to put a law in place that says you have to air 30% Canadian content. And they're far from the only country that does that. American media is enormously, enormously influential. I should mention, though, that I should mention American media is so influential that it's actually changing the business model of media outlets around the world. So in places like the UK, where they do have strong traditions of public media ownership, that is a microphone, those nations are still getting to the point where they are seeing commercial for-profit media come in and start playing a bigger role in their media systems. So in the UK, private television stations were illegal up through the 1970s. But a private broadcaster called Sky came in, broadcasting from a satellite, as the name suggests, and with Sky TV, the UK got private television for the first time. And nowadays, there are dozens of American TV channels, again, including CNN. Hey, that wasn't very nice. And again, including CNN, that you can get all over the UK and all over Europe, right? I should mention, though, that influence does go both ways. If you've ever wondered why it seems like movie plots are getting simpler these days, and why it is that Hollywood makes nothing but big-budget action blockbusters, well, there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the U.S. domestic film market is now smaller than, hey, it's not very nice of you. The U.S. domestic film market is now smaller than, ow! Jesus! Come walk around on my desk and then just start biting at me when I'm not paying attention to you. I have work to do, cat. Anyway, the foreign market for U.S. films is now bigger than the domestic market for U.S. films. More money is made on, Transformers 18 in the overseas theaters than is made here in domestic theaters, and that has to do with the rise of the global middle class and people's ability to actually go afford to go to the movies. Are you back? Okay, you better not bite me. I'm throwing you on the other side of the room. You start biting me. But so because of this, Hollywood is moving towards action movies. And away from things like dramas and comedies. That's because dramas and comedies often require deep social knowledge of a culture, and often they don't translate well to a different society. Though sometimes they do. Just a random story. I was taking a bus in China from Pingyao, which is this beautiful little walled city, to the nearest high-speed train station. And during this bus drive, they put on a Chinese movie. It was set in China with Chinese characters in Mandarin, so but it was and I swear, shot for shot remake of the John Candy movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And it worked. It totally worked. I mean, by that time I spoke enough Mandarin to laugh along with the jokes, and it absolutely worked. But also, my ex and I were just like cracking up that they totally ripped off this movie, just like I said, shot for shot remake. They just moved everything to China. So sometimes comedy translates. Most of the time, though, it doesn't. Certainly doesn't translate as well as fight scenes, chase scenes, explosions, right? So movie plots are being written to be more easily translated, to be more easily sold on the I don't know why that moved, on the foreign market. Okay, let's see. Moving on from there. Talk about how the media cover war, terrorism, and elections. Any questions so far? Just go ahead and say something if you got a question. I'll hold for a minute. Get some water. Okay, nobody's saying anything, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, war and terrorism. So, back in the day, war reporters were kind of on their own. Right? During the era of World War I, if you wanted to report on the war, well, you grabbed a helmet, you ran into the combat zone with a notepad and pen, and you took your chances. War correspondents did difficult, life-threatening work. With World War II and the kind of the second major nationwide home front mobilization, during World War II, the U.S. Army kind of realized the importance of keeping Americans informed on the progress of the war if they were to keep, buying war bonds and putting up with rationing and growing their victory gardens and stuff like that. So they actually started the practice in World War II of embedding war correspondents with the armed forces as they traveled out there. And that worked really well for World War II. Vietnam came along, and Korea came along, they continued to do it. Vietnam came along, they continued to do it. So they continued to have these war correspondents who would travel with the U.S. Army and report on what was going on. And then you started seeing, and you've all seen the picture of that little Vietnamese girl covered in napalm, naked, her body on fire, fleeing her village, which is just full of dead people and stuff like that. That was the My Lai massacre, which if you really want to see the photos, that photo is in your textbook. You can Google them. I'm not going to pull them up because we don't need to see any more death right now. So war correspondents started sending back stuff like that. And the Army said, we really don't appreciate you folks making us look bad out there. And so they kicked out the reporters from being embedded with the troops. And so the reporters did what people often do when they're told not to do something, and they doubled down. Right? They started sending back more dispatches of more American atrocities in Vietnam, eventually culminating in the Pentagon Papers and a serious question of why our nation was in the war in the first place. So, at that point, the Army learned their lesson. And so when it came time for the first Gulf War, the military said, okay, here's the deal. You can ride along with us, but we get to check your footage before you report it in, right? That's the deal. You can come with us, you can get all this access to the troops, you can see what's going on, where the fighting is, all that good stuff. And oh, by the way, we'll keep you from getting shot in the middle of this war zone, but we get to censor what you report, right? So that is kind of the standard of U.S. war reporting at this point, which is why it was so important when Chelsea Manning released all those documents to WikiLeaks so that we could see a more honest side of what was going on in war, because what you're getting in the mainstream press from embedded reporters is censored, right? It is designed to put the military in a favorable light. Chelsea Manning, by the way, is out of jail again, so that is awesome. So wars and terrorism bear... No, I don't need to hear about CCEA stuff right now. So wars and terrorist attacks drive viewership. They are dramatic. People tune in to find out about what's going on with the war, with terror attacks, right? Right after 9/11, people were glued to their TVs for days, myself included. But reporters often have a serious dilemma when reporting on terror attacks, especially ones that don't directly affect, like, the United States, right? So reporting on terror attacks in nations around the world, in, say, the New York Times. An academic study actually found that an article in the New York Times about a terrorist attack in a country will produce, on average, one additional death from terrorism in that country that year. So it's a small effect, but dramatic news coverage really does inspire would-be terrorists to seek notoriety through violent and possibly suicidal attacks. So reporters have to be cautious, have to really weigh the benefits of, is it more important to inform the public about what's going on in, say, Afghanistan? Or is it more important to protect, Afghanis? Okay, yeah, you're in the shot. You gotta move. So yeah, war and terror, major draws for media audiences. Another big drama, election campaigns, which we're going to talk about in more detail probably in like 10-20 minutes here. I'm just going to let everybody know I'm going to stop this stream and start a new one so that I have a clearer division between chapters 9 and 10, and so you don't have to go find where my chapter 10 lecture starts. So anticipate that this stream is going to go down for a minute, and then I will be right back with my chapter 10 lecture. It's just for editing purposes, right? But so the campaign is dramatic, right? Election campaigns involve political conflict, and we love nothing more than a good fight in America. Our campaigns our media is often obsessed with, okay, well, who's going to win, right? When we cover the campaign, our media is often, obsessed with things that aren't necessarily policy relevant, right? We spend a lot of time talking about, in the very beginning, who's going to run, or who's running, who's in, who's out. In the middle, who's ahead, right? The horse race. What do the polls look like? And then in the end, who won and why, right? And get out of my way. So the digital media even speed up the pace of that information. I mean, again, we have the phenomena of She really does want my attention. She really, really does. But she doesn't want to be touched. She wants to sit on you, but she does not want you to touch her. Because she is a mean little cat. She's adorable, though. It sucks everybody in. But she's evil. Don't be fooled. Anyway, so digital media have sped up the pace of this information. We often see live tweets of debates and things like that. And a story can fly around the world in seconds. But that has just further exacerbated this media obsession with, okay, who's ahead, who's behind, who's winning, who's not, why, right? Much of this is to the detriment of actual issues in the campaign. So in 1968, the average soundbite of a candidate ran for 40 seconds. And I'm going to really quickly just grab my one. Oh, actually I have a second sweep right there. So 40 seconds starting from now. So 40 seconds is actually a reasonably long amount of time. It's not hard to convey a whole paragraph worth of information, lay out, the particulars of a policy agenda, and spend some time really talking about what you're going to do as a politician once you get into office. 40 seconds is actually an enormous amount of time because I'm finding it kind of difficult to fill without moving on to a different subject, because I haven't gotten to 40 seconds until right about now. That's a lot of time, right? On the other hand, today's average campaign soundbite runs for 8 seconds. And so 8 seconds starting now. You really can't explain a whole lot in 8 seconds. It's about a sentence, maybe 2. That's 8 seconds. You're done. So, do you think we probably get less detailed policy debates in our media? Nowadays that sound bites are shorter, right? Do you think that maybe politicians don't get rewarded for thinking in complex and nuanced ways, and they might have gotten rewarded for that in the past, right? By the way, it's one of the tricks that they use to distract you from this fact. They will run video of the politician, and then they'll have the audio of their words for like 7-8 seconds, and then they'll cut the audio and go to a commentator, but keep the video up on that politician talking. So it seems like you're getting a lot of information about this politician talking, but really you only heard them for 5 seconds, even though you saw 25 seconds worth of video or so. And one of the most enduring features of campaign coverage are candidate profiles. Candidate profiles sketch a profile of each candidate, and that image will shape future coverage, right? Hillary Clinton is crooked and shifty. Donald Trump is, bigoted and mean-spirited, right? And just crude. Bernie Sanders is sexist, right? Media sketches a profile of each candidate, and these profiles are really hard to escape. That image shapes future coverage. Anything that reinforces that idea gets covered, right? I mean, that whole Liz Warren leak about Bernie Sanders maybe once told her that he didn't think a woman could win the presidency, which he denies saying, but because it fits that profile of, Bernie is leading this movement of a bunch of white straight men, but Bernie is leading this movement of white straight men, so when Liz Warren accused him of sexism, that got enormous amounts of coverage because it fit the profile, right? When Hillary Clinton got in very mild amounts of trouble for doing something that literally every politician does and used her personal email account for government business, it became a national scandal because it fit that profile of, oh, Hillary is crooked, right? And further, a lot of media outlets don't want to seem like they're biased in favor of the liberal candidates. So they were covering all these Donald Trump scandals, and a lot of journalists felt like they had to cover the Hillary Clinton scandal at the same time, just to be fair, right? So so candidate profiles are an enormous and an important part of our media coverage. Really prominent example of this one, Bush versus Gore, 2000. And I mean, okay, so at the time of this election, I'm like 13, I think? 14. 14 by the time they actually voted. So I'm not that old. Like, I'm not an adult yet, but I'm paying attention to politics. Like I said, I've been voting since I was 13 years old because I paid attention to politics when I was very young. And I was going nuts because the media coverage about this election was almost exclusively about how Al Gore was this stuffed shirt, lecturing, moralizing, finger-wagging, ivory tower academic, this egghead lecturing Americans on public policy. And that George W. Bush, well, he was just a good old boy from the country, and you could go have a beer with him. Never mind the fact that George W. Bush is from Connecticut. He bought his ranch in Texas 6 months before he ran for governor of Texas and sold it 6 months after retiring from the presidency. And this is a true fact. George W. Bush, the cowboy president from Texas, is afraid of horses. There were no horses on his ranch. He would actually mountain bike, which, honestly, I'm a cyclist too. I'm down with that. But yeah, so had this image as this, good old Texas cowboy when he's a preppy boy from Connecticut who's scared of horses, right? That's the power of candidate profiles, right? And so a lot of people didn't vote for Al Gore just because he seemed like a naggy academic, whinging at people about climate change. Which, of course, now, 20 years later, the planet is boiling. And we really, really wish we had listened to Al Gore in the first place. So new media can raise, can and has raised the prospect of great changes in campaigning. The Obama election was Obama campaign was the first to really effectively use the new media to mobilize supporters. So we already talked about how candidates can speak directly to voters, and that sort of power has only grown since the days of FDR's fireside chats and radio. Candidates can use Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all these various different media websites in order to connect with their voters, even when their voters are, say, quarantined by a global pandemic. New media can give candidates, voters, a sense of belonging. You don't just join a campaign. You make connections with people. You make friends. You join a group, right? You go hang out with each other. We'll talk about solidarity benefits when we get to chapter 12 on interest groups, and that is actually a thing. But the campaign is also able to mobilize supporters very quickly, again, from wherever they are. You can go to berniesanders.com/call, and you will be able to run through, calling voters for the Bernie Sanders campaign and helping turn them out to vote. You can do it anytime you want, right? I'm not saying that you should. In fact, it looks like Bernie's probably dropping out, and we're going to have to vote for Joe Biden. I'll do it, but so that's what social media does. It allows, or that's what new media, that's what the internet does, is that it allows politicians to mobilize supporters wherever those supporters are and whatever it is that they are doing. You can get an army of volunteers to help propel your campaign. Anyway, that's the end of my media lecture. if anybody has any questions, I'm going to do another one of those like awkward 30-second pauses. And, you know, if you just, you don't have to type the whole question. If you just like type a question mark, I'll know you have a question, and then I'll stop and wait a second for you to type the rest of it. So if anyone got any questions, let me know in chat. She's back. She's back. God damn it. Okay, seeing no questions from anybody, and you guys are easy, I'm going to go ahead and drop this stream, like I said, because it's the end of my Chapter 9 lecture, and I'm going to be back in just a couple minutes here with my lecture on Chapter 10. We're going to start talking about campaigns and elections.